Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Isaac Smith. He's the executive director at Whole Wellness Therapy. He's the psychotherapist. The website is wholewellnesstherapy.com, W-H-O-L-E, as in whole. So, Isaac, welcome and thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot for having me here, Richard. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking today.
Yeah, if you would, tell me a bit about your background and what led you to psychotherapy and establishing this center.
Yeah, for me, I never wanted to be a therapist. When I went into my social work program, my goal was to work in hospice, and I didn't want to touch therapy with a 10-foot pole. And what ended up happening is my first 2 internships were both in counseling roles. The first one working for Catholic Social Services, and the second one was at a methadone clinic. And I really fought tooth and nail not to go there because I had my own ideas at that time around addiction. But it was really at that job and in that role where I sort of fell in love with getting to do work that I view as very sacred and important, and also working with folks that were struggling with issues related to addiction and trauma. So that sort of began the trajectory, and I did end up working in hospice and a number of other things in between there. But I kind of kept going back to therapy in my mind. It's such a privilege to get to sit across from people and hear their story and for them to trust you with that information, and to support them and kind of figuring out what paths are right for them. So
what kind of group do you speak to most often, and what are their issues?
You mean like what kind of folks do I tend to work with?
Right, exactly. And what core issues, what kind of people, old people, young people, what issues, et cetera.
Yeah. So I've been doing therapy in one form or another for almost a decade at this point, and I've worked with all ages. I have teen clients to adult clients to older adult clients, and I think sort of naturally what happened for our practice is we started seeing a lot more folks coming in with issues related to trauma, and not just like what we would call those big T traumas, like maybe getting into a car accident or experiencing some sort of assault, but those little T traumas is what we'd call them. But, the trauma that happens for folks over a lifetime, depending on, how they grew up or the environment that they grew up in. And so our practice is in the area that we're in really does focus a lot on helping folks, live the life that they want, even if they have this trauma in their past or it's still showing up. So anxiety, depression, trauma, addiction related issues, relationship issues, grief and loss. The cool thing about our center in particular is that it's very collaborative. So we have a number of therapists a ton of diversity that they bring to the table, just their life experience, what they're passionate about and what they're interested in. So we learn a lot from each other, but we also have a number of practitioners that, specialize in one thing over the other, whether that's couples work or anxiety-related stuff, grief and loss, like I said.
All right, so what are some of the issues that you're seeing, let's say, in teens in particular?
Yeah, with teens, substance issues are always really present. What I think we've seen tremendously, and especially in the past few years, is a dramatic increase in things like anxiety and depression. I often kind of think like teens are sort of like the canary in the coal mine at times for issues that might be present in the family that haven't been addressed. And so when it comes to that work, I also really want to involve the family in that process as much as I can. But yeah, teens, I think, are in this really exciting stage of figuring out who they are and what's important to them and what their values are and who they want to be. So it's a lot about like their identity. And that's hard stuff too, because their brain is still developing, right? We know now from neuroscience, right, that the brain fully develops by the age of 25. And so teens are kind of like working out, building that adult part of their self while still, having a teenage brain that sometimes can get in the way.
So why do you think anxiety is so prevalent among teens? Is this a new phenomenon, or is this something that's always been there?
That's a really good question. I think it's always been in there. It's always been there in one form or another. I think like this collective trauma and anxiety that we've experienced together as a global society as it relates to the pandemic really had an impact. This is totally anecdotal, but I do some work in something that's called dialectical behavior therapy, and that's very much that agency is focused on working with teens and families. And, one of the parents was talking to us about how their school was saying, they used to have about 80 kids that were in independent study in this one school. Over the course of the year, that's translated into 1,800 kids that are in independent study because of these anxiety-related issues.
What does independent study mean? Is that homeschooling, or is it just their course of study is customized? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's basically like doing your schoolwork from your home. Yeah, not like homeschooling, but it's through this.
So people are okay. So a lot of people were forced onto Zoom, etc. But now that happened for so long, you're seeing a lot of families requesting turn to that in partial or in whole.
I think a lot of it is teens experiencing like the anxiety of being in these very busy and often chaotic environments, right? And they're not really used to it, right? And there's still, this looming threat that we're all dealing with, and in one form or another. And so I think, kids are anxious about those things. They're anxious about, the changes that are happening in our world, and a lot of them feel powerless as far as how to approach those big issues. So I don't know if it's be hard to pinpoint it as one thing, but I think it's like a combination of things and shifts that are just happening as a population.
Well, what are some without revealing personal details, what are some stories in common that you hear from a lot of the people that you work with, a lot of the teenagers?
Yeah, it's a lot of social anxiety, like this fear of being evaluated, right? Like the fear of being judged. And again, in this really important identity formation stage, I think school is a lot more demanding these days too. And there's this pressure to achieve and to do well. I think I would say the social anxiety part, and at least in the area we're at, like kids really feeling pressure to achieve, to figure out where they're going to college and what they're going to do with their life, but as soon as they're a freshman, and just figuring out who they are. I mean, that's a big task in and of itself. But relationship issues and all of that shows up at this crucial stage in their development also create a ton of anxiety, their sense of belonging, community.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Well, also, for teenagers, if they were caught up in pandemic-related stuff for 2 years, that's a big chunk of a teenager's life versus someone, let's say, that's like 30s or 40s or 50s. So I guess it makes sense that they would be very heavily impacted because, again, that's a lot of time for someone that age. Someone younger, it's even more time in terms of development. So I guess it makes sense that that's what's happening. I mean, do you think that, again, school has gotten more difficult, or is it just the resiliency of teens, or the, the constant low or medium or high level pressure to perform is just harder for them now because of what they went through?
That's a really good question, Richard, which I don't know if I have the answer to. I think it's probably a combination of all of that. And, I believe that there are no real one-size-fits-all approaches to doing this kind of work. In fact, like, that's something I really push against. And with that, each person is different. So something that, we might perceive as being like an easy task might be really difficult for someone else, and vice versa. But yeah, if learning to be social in an online environment is difficult. It's hard to do for some people over Zoom. There's an exhaustion sometimes that people have about being online for everything now. I think as a society, we really are craving like actual, real, authentic community and connection. And I think if we zoom way out, there are forces in play that sell us this idea of community and belonging that's really about making profit.
Do you think it's a mistake to allow kids to continue to do school from home? Is it coddling them? Do they really need it? Are they freaking out if they can't get it? Like, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think it's coddling. I think it's what some of the kids need, right? They might need it for right now. And, I believe that a dialectical behavior therapy, they have this great saying that people are doing that. There's this assumption that people are doing the best they can and people need to do better, right? And so I think it's about meeting people where they're at and also inviting them to explore some of those goals. And depending on what those goals are, the obstacles that are getting in the way. And so it might be that what a kid needs is a lot more of that support, and for the parents to actually get on board and say, yeah, you know what, if this is what you're needing, your mental health is really important to us, then we're going to work with you here. And, we are going to gently push you along the way to kind of move outside of your comfort zone a bit. And, as a therapist, my real philosophy and belief is that the only way out for most things that we face in life is to go through it. It's so easy to distract ourselves from all of our problems or the struggles that we're facing on a day-to-day basis. The problem with distraction is it only lasts in the short term, and you can't distract yourself in the long term. So it's only partially effective. So I think that's a case-by-case basis. And yeah, I don't think it's a coddling thing. I think people really need, to kind of have some space.
Yeah, I learned a concept recently called moral injury. So if someone is a police officer for 10 years and all they see is, people lying to them and doing bad things, they kind of get corrupted by seeing that. Or if someone was a prostitute, after they have normal relationships with people. Do you think there's any form of moral injury that kids have endured because of the pandemic and because of these conditions?
Going back to this idea of trauma, right? I believe that like trauma gives us this rule book to follow. It gives us a set of rules to follow to keep us safe. And this usually happens on a very unconscious level. It's not like we're sitting there going, oh, my trauma gave me this rule or that rule. But it could be about like, hey, don't trust anyone, because when you've trusted people in the past, this has led to you getting really hurt, right? And so people withdraw from social relationships and connections as a way to avoid pain. But then again, that might get in the way later when they really want authentic and deep connection and relationship. And so that rule that might have been very protective and saved them, depending on what environment they grew up in, is now getting in the way. And so I think another way to think about it is like trauma gives you a pair of glasses at which you view the world, and you can see, somebody might do something that reminds you of a traumatic thing you went through, and then that's all you're going to see. So I think if we think about the pandemic as being this collective trauma that we all faced, that we all had to just react to, right? We couldn't prepare for, but we had to react to. I think it's safe to say that probably had effects on teenagers and all of us that we're still figuring out, that we're still trying to understand how and what are the long-term implications of this collective trauma that we've been through.
Yeah, when you mentioned that, I'm sure it's obvious. A lot of teenagers, will use drugs. I guess, if someone's labeled as an addict, I'm sure that would
Yeah.
really traumatize them. But, how much are they traumatizing themselves by doing drugs? Whether it's smoking weed or,
Yep.
something heavier, and maybe becoming addicted or getting to the point where, like, in order to go to sleep, they need to get high or something so they can sleep, or in order to handle a social situation, they have to get high in order to be calm. What does that do to them?
Yeah. So I love what you said about the label, right? I think the label can sometimes be really important for people, right? Like if you go to a 12-step meeting, identifying, as, an alcoholic can be really important for some people. And it can be very limiting for others, or limit people in general, because then they sort of see themselves as this one part of them, albeit it's been an important part or a part that's created problems, but it's not the totality of who they are. When it comes to using substances, no matter what we consume, right, we have a relationship with it. And people don't use drugs and alcohol because they don't work. They use them because they work really well. And going back, they work really well in the short term. The problem is they often can create these long-term problems, whether it's like a full-fledged addiction or problems in relationships or health problems, you name it. And so you are right that, doing those things is harming themselves. And it's also been something, I've had some people that have told me drinking like saved me from suicide. And if I come in there and I just sort of demonize the substance or the problem, then I really miss out on understanding how that relationship, right, has really served them, how it's been helpful, how it's been adaptive, right? And now where is it getting in the way? So addiction is kind of like your lover and your best friend and your worst enemy and your father or your mother, all wrapped up in one thing. So to try to strip somebody from that relationship before understanding that relationship and really getting to know that relationship, I think can be really dangerous, especially if you're not helping someone cope in other ways, or especially cope in ways that are more connected to some of these long-term values that they might have. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it gives a good perspective on it. I didn't think about that. If someone tells you, again, drinking helped them not commit suicide, then you're like, well, now we've got a potential addiction or bad lifelong habit, but look what it did for them. So they're going to perceive it as, it's just going to make it, I guess, entrenched and much harder to get rid of that habit, because the person will credit that, at least in their mind, of helping them to avoid death. So, it makes it difficult.
Exactly.
What about parents and caretakers? Everyone has to deal with, pandemic-related issues. As a parent of kids, like, you not only need to make sure your mind is right, but that you can be there for your children. And perhaps that's just too much of a burden for a lot of people if they were affected very badly as a parent. How do they help themselves and help their children?
Yeah.
Has there been like a withdrawal of parental support that you see? Emotional, monetary, physical? Is that making it worse?
Going back, I think one of the things that I saw during the pandemic and when we were all kind of like, back in our homes all together, I think for some families, they were able to distract from their problems through like busyness, right? Whether that's extracurricular activities after school or getting kids into gymnastics or this or that, or this academic program, like a lot of that stuff went away. And then we were sort of stuck with each other. And I think for a lot of families, they had to maybe face things that they weren't willing or wanting to face until they now are forced to have the space to kind of look at them. And I think that a lot of the times, parents get blamed for a lot. And I don't think, there's a great book I just read by Dr. Gabor Mate called The Myth of Normal. And he talks a lot about this. I don't think that is particularly helpful. It certainly can be illuminating for people that have experienced real lifelong abuse, right? So I don't want to minimize or invalidate that. But I think, parents are also doing the best that they can, and they can do a bit better. And I think that the place that they can do a bit better is to have that constant communication of support and love for their children, to not make that warmth and nurturing side of them contingent on good behavior, right? So that, you get all this loving acceptance, validation from me as long as you're towing the party line. And when you're not, like, I withhold all of that. In fact, I think that that's when kids need it more, is when they're hurting. And they look to us as adults and parents to really show them how to digest some of the things that we're going through. And I think that, parents can be a bit more honest about maybe some of their own struggles in a way that doesn't, burden the child by sharing that, right? But just in a way of normalizing our shared humanness. So I think, I always encourage parents, like, hey, just pick up that phone and say, hey, just thought about you. Just want to tell you I love you. Send them a text. Check in with them about things. Also respect their need for independence and how that's growing as well. So it's a tightrope walk, I think, especially in the teenage years.
Yeah, and I would think single-parent households right now, it's probably 10 times tougher on them because the parent may or may not have anyone to speak to, another adult, and they have to help themselves and help their children. And, with the increased stresses and problems, I could see that'd be a very difficult job, especially now.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. Yeah, I had a single mom too, and I watched how hard she worked and all that she gave to try to make sure that we did okay. But I think, it's particularly hard for parents that don't have supports, or who have another parent that's maybe disengaged, or that relationship is not so good. So I have a lot of empathy for parents facing that situation, and I believe that they are trying their best.
Do you see any therapists or any new ideas that seem to be particularly effective right now in our current environment that are helping a lot?
Yeah. I practice as a relational psychotherapist. And that means that I believe that people are wired, and what's driving all of us is a need for relationship and connection. And so I think that no matter what modality a therapist might use, right? So there's cognitive behavioral therapy, there's dialectical behavior therapy, was actually under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy. There's narrative therapy, there's EMDR, there's all of these modalities. I think that they are most effective when they're housed in a real, authentic relationship. And so I think what we're sort of fighting against in some ways is, and this is normal, people come in and they want symptom relief, right? They're experiencing this anxiety or depression and they just want it to be taken away. I want to help them build some coping tools and strategies around how to deal with those things. And the uncomfortable reality is that no coping tool is going to remove those issues from somebody permanently. They'll come back. Like, I have gotten quite familiar with my own relationship with anxiety, right? Like, I used to think I didn't have it, but I do. And instead of it like being in the driver's seat of my car, I've learned to put it in the passenger seat at times, or kick it to the back seat or the trunk. So I think that what we're trying to do, at least at our practice, is normalize being a human and trying to understand all the difficulties and the suffering that comes with being a human, and help people cope with some of these issues that they're facing with. But really to see themselves as not the summation of their problems, right? Like, the problems are the problems. This is an idea from narrative therapy. People are not their problems, right? The fact that somebody is struggling with an addiction is not the most important thing about them. It might be the most dominating thing, the most oppressive thing in their life at the time, but it is not the most important thing about who they are. And I think my work is to help people become connected or reconnected with parts of themselves that have been walled off or lost, whether it's because of trauma or addiction or anxiety or loss, whatever it is help people see themselves for more than just that issue. So I don't know, it sounds like, again, I'm an armchair psychologist here, but it just sounds like more group therapy may help. It sounds like individual therapy, I'm sure it always helps, but more group settings, mixing it in a bit more. Let's say you have a session a week, at least once a month, you do a group type thing. Maybe that would help a lot. I don't know. I really like that idea, and I think that there's a lot of truth in that. I tell all of the therapists here at Whole Wellness Therapy, like, you got to have skin in the game. Like, you have to be open enough in your work with people to being moved by them at times, right? To they're going to be in your mind when you leave at times, right? Have great boundaries around that, right? But to to do a kind of therapy that allows you to be impacted by the client. So I think that relationship with, I do mostly individual work and some group work, but everything I believe is about relationships. So when the first time that somebody reaches out to us to get connected, like the relationship starts, and the relationship can give us a lot of clues about what might be happening in somebody's life or how they might be relating to others. And I think that what we see is that as the relationship, I think it's the most healing part of therapy, that as that sort of unfolds, it now starts to translate to relationships outside of the therapy setting, right? Because like one of the secrets that I think is lost on people is that the therapy space, being a confidential space, is really one where you can try out a lot of things in a relationship that you normally wouldn't be able to, right? Like you can role play having a difficult conversation. You can practice like telling your therapist when maybe something your therapist has said lands the wrong way, or that you fear that they're judging you, or that they caused you harm. Like a good therapist should be able to take all of that in and allow that to happen, because it can give us, there's so much richness that comes out of like being in that space.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, who do you guys serve? Are you able to do remote work? Or is it just in state? Like where, if someone's listening and they're getting good concepts out of it, that's great. But if they actually say, all right, I need a therapist, I need help. What areas or what demographics or psychographics do you help with?
Yeah, so we work with all ages here. Like I said, we are primarily focused on helping people overcome or kind of like learn to have a different relationship with the trauma or maybe the things that they consume, like if there are addiction issues, anxiety, depression, grief and loss. We do both in-person work here. We have a location in Fair Oaks, California, and also in Sacramento, California, in Midtown. And then we do a lot of remote work via telehealth, all within the state of California, which is currently the bounds, legal bounds of who we can serve. I'd love to be able to work with people, in different states and stuff, but right now we're only allowed to work with folks inside of California. For people that
you only have like 45 million people, I guess, to potentially work with, so it's not very much.
Yeah, but for your listeners that are maybe trying to find a therapist in their state, there are a couple good resources. There's one called psychologytoday.com, which people can search for a therapist by their insurance or by private pay. For folks that, it's a struggle to pay for therapy out of pocket and they need a sliding scale, there's a great site called Open Path Collective, which has very low fees for most people that can get those services. They can get them through their insurance. I'm trying to think if there's any other great resources. Another good site is goodtherapy.com, where it's similar to Psychology Today. And then, I'm blanking on it.
No problem. Those are good resources so far, yeah. Well, Isaac, thank you for coming on the podcast and, for providing these resources and entertaining these ideas and for what you do in general to help people and especially teens. So, again, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Like I said, I feel really honored to be on, and love chatting today.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.